This time on the Random Junk channel, we're going to be showing you how to extend the on-off switches, and this one has a volume as well, from your unit. So if it's too short, so this is usually, this knot here is usually the part that sticks out. So you got 13 inches, give or take. So if this isn't a big display and you need more length, I'm going to show you how to extend these. Now, this is usually tied in a knot that you can't pull through your house. In some cases, they put a zip tie or glue, depending on the age or type of unit. And then this, same thing, you can see the knot where I undid it. This is just your standard off-on switch. Now, this will work with any of the houses, whether it's Department 56, Mr. Christmas, Limax, that has a cabled switch. So if it's got the wheel on the inside or the back of the house or a switch on the house, like a lot of them do, this won't work. But this is good for if you have a big display and you need to extend it so you can turn them off and on, especially the ones that need to be turned off manually. Because let's say you have one of those, we just did Halloween season here, you have one of those 2 or 3 or 4 foot wide and 10-foot long displays, and you got to reach to the back to turn one off. I'm going to show you different ways to extend the wires. This one's the easiest, and I'll talk about the other ways to do it, but I'm just going to make it the easiest for you at home. That way you don't have to tear apart your house. So the correct or more proper way is to open it up and disconnect it from the circuit board, or open the switch and disconnect it from the switch and then resolder it. A lot of people, time, patience, and ability may not be there to do that. So I'm going to give you a couple options on how to do it in the center or close to the end, either side, either the house side or the switch side, with wire. You will need a wire. Now, this is a 2-wire. You can get 2-wire. This is a 5-wire. Most wires, depending on how you buy them, come in 4, just so you know. So this one makes it a little more difficult. So you need to take a 4-wire and a single strand off of here. This stuff peels. You can find 5-wire. It's just not as common nor as easy as finding 4-wire. I mean, you can get a roll of 4-wire for like $20, and 5-wire is going to cost you like 40. So it depends on your ease and what you want to do and what you have lying around. I have a ton of 4-wire, a ton of 2-wire. I don't have any 5-wire left, so we're just going to do with what I got. And it's the same principle. Now, on the Limax, the older style were solid colors. So you got gray, gray, white, blue, yellow, green. The newer Limax are pastels, like this one, where it's pink and white. So you might have this, and this might be, it might be a lighter gray. White's usually the same, but you might have a pastel green, a pastel yellow, a pastel blue, or this might even be a pastel pink. So it depends on the age of your house, the actual shading of the wires. The shading of the wires isn't important. It's just to make sure that you connect the same color wire to the same color wire. Most 4-wires come in codes like this, RGBB. Red, green, blue, black. This one is red, green, black, white. So those are the kind of standard color codes for 4-wire. 2-wire is usually just black and red. You can get them in colors. This is just general stuff, and I just want to go over the basics. Now, if you have a house that you're just wanting to extend the power on and you don't care about the volume, let's say you're like me and you don't use the volume, and if you buy a house that has a broken volume chip, it doesn't matter because you never turn on your volume. The only wires you're concerned about would be the 2 fatter wires. So you can see those are rather fat and those are rather thin in comparison. This is your power. These 2 wires here, again, whether it's gray and white or the new pastel pink and white, like this one. And then these wires, you can just leave disconnected, and the volume knob won't do the volume anymore. It's pretty rare that I'll disconnect those. I've had some sent in that they didn't want the volume, so we just disconnected the 3 wires. You don't have to open your house to do it. You can disconnect them in here too, or if you extend this, when you extend it, you only extend it too. So I'm going to go over a couple of ways for extensions. I'm going to give you choices of soldering, butt connecting, and Wago connecting. Now Wago is the biggest and bulkiest, but allows you to quickly disconnect the extended wire so you can roll it up into your box. So that is the option for ease of storage, because if you notice, sometimes when you put these in your box, you got to find a little spot that it slides in and the wire coils inside of it, and you don't have a lot of room, depending on how you store your items. If they're in your OEM box, you just store them separately. So solder, you've all seen how it's done. We'll go over that one probably first, but you need solder. You're probably going to need some types of heat shrink. Here's just a small piece as a representation. Then we'll go into butt connecting and Wago connecting. So let's start with the solder. So the first thing we do is turn on the soldering iron, get it nice and warm. Now, sometimes you need to flux the wires. So I have a flux pen that comes in a paste tube. Not always. Technically, there's flux inside some of this wire here. This says it's got 1.8% flux, but sometimes that's just not enough. As far as heat shrink, that's kind of fat for these wires. Like I said, this is just a representation, but you can take something like this and slide it over the wires before you solder them. So that way you can heat shrink the whole thing. Now this does come in colors, so if you don't want it to be red on black or black on white, you can get it in colors, as you can see by the assortment here. So if you have a Christmas piece and it's white, you can get some white heat shrink. If you're doing a Halloween piece and it's black heat shrink. I'm going to do some different color just so you can see how it's done. That's the whole point, is to make it visible on the camera. Wire strippers, wire cutters, you're going to need those too. Now, what I'll do is, since we're going to extend this, we're going to do the soldering one on this one. I'm going to, this has cutters too, at the center, like so. I'm going to use the gauge here, where it has gauge, and this one's just gauge. Sometimes they have the, yeah, this one's gauge only. Sometimes they have two different sets of numbers. If you're not familiar with them, one's gauge, one's millimeters. This is gauge, and all I want to do is cut the sheathing off, so I still have the two wires inside intact. And like so. Let's get this one out of the way. Now, you can make them longer so you can get heat shrink in here, or you can make them short and you can use liquid electrical tape or electrical tape in general. But I'm going to use sheathing, so I'm going to cut a little more off so I can get heat shrink on these. Now, sometimes this small wire, see, this only goes down to 22 gauge. This wire is like 24, 26, so it doesn't really strip it very well. So if you can use your fingernail. I've seen people use their teeth. I don't recommend it unless you want to get falsies faster than you need to. You can just lightly score it with a set of side cutters and then just peel off the insulation. So I'm only putting enough pressure to barely cut through the wire insulation and then pulling off the ends. Like so. Now, I got my red on here. I mean, you could have done it after you cut it. I'm not going to have a full house here on display to do it because it just gets in the way. On this next part, you have two options as well. Sometimes options are great, and sometimes options just make things more confusing or difficult. So, you can put heat shrink on both sets of wires. Also, I recommend sliding the heat shrink over before you strip the wires. It does make it easier, but, you know, too long. You want to make sure the heat shrink falls far enough back that it doesn't get hot from the solder and shrink. So I can do both wires, or I can only do one, and then this one will cover the other. And on my houses, this is usually how I do it, so I have a smaller bulge, because you're going to have a bulge where you stripped and heat shrunk and soldered your wires. So choices again, we got choices. So how I do it, and that's just because these wires are so small, is I take the wires, I stick the pink with the pink, in this case, I twist them together, kind of like you're twisting a bread tie. Take my solder and soldering iron, and then I solder. And you get the wire hot enough that it soaks in the solder. Now luckily this wire is good quality and I didn't need to use any additional flux. Sometimes the wires are poor quality and you have to use additional flux. And not to go too deeply into wire, you have copper wire, you have tin wire, you have aluminum wire, and then you have copper wire that's coated over aluminum or aluminum plated wire. And that stuff is some of the worst stuff to work with, and that's where you usually need your extra flux. So, there we go. Make sure that's a good. It didn't penetrate the whole way. There we go. So we're going to get it hot again. There we go. So the solder is attracted to the heat. So you want to get the wire hot enough that the solder soaks into the wire. That one did it perfectly. This one, because it was moving, it didn't do so good. So that's why I just rehit it. Once I do that, I fold the soldered piece over, and then I slide the heat shrink on it. A lot of places say that's improper, and technically it is. But on this really thin wire, it's really hard to do it the proper way, which is to strand it together and make it in a straight line. And I've broken so many that at least this works, and then the heat shrink keeps it bonded, and you don't have to worry about the wire breaking. Now, you can use a heat gun, hair dryer. I use a lighter most of the time just because it's faster than a heat gun. And then we want to heat shrink that. So there we go. There we go. And now we take the white, fold it flat, and this is what we're talking about, and we stick it back. Now I know you're all going, you just soldered the original wire back together. Correct. What I would normally do is put this in the middle. And I would match the red to the pink and the black to the white. But I wanted to give you a quick demonstration of soldering. The other way to extend like this 2-wire, since it's going to be the easiest, and I'll use this first for reference, is this one's already stripped, except that's a little on the long side, so we're going to trim this back some. You know, is they have these things called Wagos. And if you notice, this Wago has 2 on each end, and this one has like 3 on each end. So you can pop these open. You can slide your pink on one side, clip it shut. Your white on the other side, clip it shut. And then do the same over here. You want to put the red where the pink goes, and the black where the white goes. And now you can do the same on this end and reconnect it to the same wire coming out of your house. And you can make your extension as long as you want, short as you need. And then when you're done for the season, you can say, okay, this won't fit in my house, so I can just do this, pull my wires out, tuck this in, take the other end off from here, and then just coil this up and store it inside your box in one of the empty spots in the foam. Or if you have a storage container, you can store it in your storage container. So this one is the easiest one to do because there's no volume. So I'm not going to waste the heat shrink on this one, but it gives you an idea. You just use this as an extension in between, measure it out. Now, technically you can go almost infinity on length, but it's not true. Wire has resistance. Your resistance goes up. It affects things like the volume and the power, so it means the house is dimmer. The most I've ever extended one, and that was just out of a request, was I added a 4-foot section in the middle of this wire. This 5-wire one. 4 feet. Didn't affect the house in any fashion. I didn't also use aluminum plated wire, where it's aluminum plated with copper. I used real, this is real copper. It's more expensive. So is this one. This one, I believe, is tin plated, but it's not as expensive. So when you read wire, when you buy it, make sure you read what it's made from. I try to go with a copper, higher quality, better wire, and I like it because it also absorbs heat better for soldering, and it has a lower resistive rate, so it's got a higher conductivity rate. So now I'll show you how I do the 5-wire. We'll actually put an extension on this one instead of just resoldering it back together like I did the 2-wire. So same thing. First things first, we need to cut the sheathing and get the wires exposed. And because there's 5 wires here, I'm actually going to cut a lot more off because we're going to have 5 wires to deal with. I'll just use this end since it's long enough already. We have an idea. Now, the 2 important wires for power are going to be the gray and the white, or on the new ones, the pastel and the white. And that's your power, that's your on-off. That's what connects the 4.5 volts to the board. They're also the thicker wires, so they'll handle a little bit more stress before they break. These are like 24 gauge, and these thinner wires are 28 gauge on average. I've seen them as low as 32, which is crazy thin. So I'm going to go over different options on this one too. And we'll use this wire. Now this wire is thicker. Let me strip some of this insulation off so you can see. I just brought this wire in to give you an idea of how you can get wire in multi-strand. And if you hear any background noise, it's because it's the first nice day ever in Arizona since the summertime. And it rained. It smells good, so I have the window open. And of course now you hear all the cars and stuff. So you can see this wire is much fatter than this wire. So this again was just brought in as a reference of how you can buy wire. You can buy wire where it's stuck together or single strands. You can get it in a roll with a sheathing on it, but it's much thicker. You have options. So how I'm going to do this one is I'm going to take the wires. Since this is only 4, I'm going to do 4 of those, and I'm going to take one of these. Now for the one I did for the display here in Arizona, I did this. I ran the 4 feet. I ran a single strand at 4 feet. And then I ran a piece of this type of white heat shrink the entire length when it was done. And then heated it up. So it looked like one long cable. I got my 4 wires and I got my 5 here. So black and red are common hots. So I am going to stick the black and the red on the white and the gray. And this is where you have to pay attention to what you're doing, is because you're not going to normally find the exact same color pattern as Limax. I don't know where they get their wire from, but their color patterns are always different than everybody else. Now, Department 56, the ones I've taken apart, their color pattern on their 4 and 5 wires are pretty close to this. They might be a couple of shades off, but they're usually the standard RGBB or RGBBY, because usually their 5th wire is yellow. And again, it also varies on the age of the unit. The older pieces are much different than the newer pieces. Like I was stating with Limax especially, their older pieces were solid colors and their newer pieces are the pastels. Now, if you're going to heat shrink or wrap the outside of the cable, your inner heat shrink, like these, do not matter what color. Again, I'm using bright color so you can see them on camera as a visual aid. So I'm going to make the gray wire black on my strands here. And the white wire red on my strands here. Now we're going to solder these. There we go. Now, if you notice, they're really long. You're like, ah, that's too long. Too long is better than too short. Because once you solder them, they're nice and rigid and you can snip off the excess. Yeah. You can always shorten something that's too long, but you can't really extend something that's too short in a lot of cases. And same thing, I'm gonna fold the wire flat, top of itself, and slide the heat shrink over, which is kind of hard to do above my head. And let's do it to this side, flat. There we go. One. And there's two. So now I'll quickly hit them with the lighter so they don't move on me. Technically shouldn't because they're a tight fit. There you go. Now, let's say you don't have a soldering iron, or you don't know how to solder. It happens. I mean, everybody has to learn. If at some point, and not everybody knows the ability or knows how to or has the ability to solder. So now we have other options, and I'm going to use the other options on this end. So we know that the black and the red are right here. So if you don't know how to solder, or you don't have a soldering iron or access to one, or a soldering pen, they make butt connectors. Now, they do make smaller ones in this red. They usually come in pink, and I'm out of them. They're usually really good for this size wire. But how a butt connector works is you need a set of wire crimpers or strippers like this where you can crimp right in here. So this is designed for 22 to 18 gauge right here. I know this is smaller than 22 gauge. That's what the pink ones are for. But like I said, I am out of my pink connectors. So you shove the wire inside, and there's a stopper about halfway in. You got to be careful because on thin wire, you might pass that stopper. Then you crush the end over the wire. Now, because these are narrow, I usually do 2 crushes side by side. They do come fatter for the crushing side, and they do have specifically just these are designed to do this, and I have those too. But I didn't feel like having 47 tools out here showing you the different options, and then you give it a little tug to make sure it's good, and that's how you would do your wire. So since this is a black wire, and we go over here to our gray, and we're going to stick our gray on this side, and we're going to stick this one in, And like so. And I go back to the crusher. Now I try to make sure that my crush, the crimp side, is always the same. Meaning that they're both it's crimped on the same side. Because it only crushes one side. And I'll show you a close-up of that here in a second. Good to go. So that way the crush is on the same side. And what I'm talking about is when you see this thing close, this is the part that does the crushing, this is the side that does the cradling. So I try to make sure that that's why I flipped the pliers when I was doing it, is because I had it backwards. You can do it backwards, but I found in the field, because I do work on high voltage stuff, when you do it backwards, it can actually weaken the inner edge of the opposite side. And it might just be the type of crush connectors, depending on what part of China they're made in. They really don't have any made in the US anymore that I've been able to find. But there you go. You can also slide heat shrink over this. So when this is on, you can shrink this whole thing. Now, the problem with these is they're going to get really fat. You do 5 of these, they're going to make a big bulge. So it's recommended that you stagger them. Now, all my wires are cut the same, so I can't. But how you stagger them is, you'd cut this wire here, I'd cut this wire here, but make this wire come up here, so this next one would be staggered. Makes it for a narrower cross section. But you can see when you have 5 wires, you have to have a really large staggering or stepping of your wiring. If you don't care about the bulge, make them all the same length just to make life easy, and you're good to go. That didn't go in straight. I have seen people solder these before they stick them in. Don't do that. You need the softness of the copper in the wire to be able to crush. If you solder the ends of this and shove it in here, you don't get the same crush factor. And then you can pull the wire out, or the wire will slide out. On low voltage, generally not a big deal. On high voltage, it can cause fire. So just a slight tug, make sure it doesn't slide out. And I'm going to put this side in, like so. Make sure that the crush side, and what's nice is if you aren't coordinated, because a lot of times I'm not, to be truthful, you can use this to hold it. Then take your wire with your other hand, shove it in, and then crush it. It didn't work because the wire folded. So that can happen. Now, unfortunately, it's crushed, so this is absolutely useless. If you don't want to cut it, I have had some success squeezing the sides to pulling it back out. Let's see if I can have success today. If it stops rotating on me, let's put it in here where it's less likely to rotate. Nope. So we'll cut it. So that is an example of what can happen if you don't pay attention to where your wire goes. And I'll give you a close-up if you've never used these on how this happens. So if you look inside, you see the silver. That's the part that crushes. This red plastic is just the insulator. If the wire hits the edge of that, it'll ball up, which is what it did on here. That's why I straightened it back out. So instead of going down the center, it went onto the edge and balled up. And then you crush it, it's not inside, it doesn't connect. So you want to make sure it's actually in before you decide to crush it. And that's why we do the pull test. Because You don't want to just do it, heat shrink it, and then have it not work, and then have to go tear everything apart to, see, that one got caught, to make it work. And before I do that, why don't we put a little heat shrink on this one as an option. Is that big enough? No, I need slightly bigger. Still tight. I have lots of heat shrink. There's the side that I need. So we run the heat shrink down it. We put the wire inside, twist it so that way there's no frays. I'm just twisting the wire to get the frays out so I can get her all the way in. See, there's my crush. And we just slide that over. See that it's centered. Yeah. And then that's how you would heat shrink over freaking wind. That's how you'd heat shrink over it if you wanted to heat shrink your butt connector. So if your butt connector is now some butt connectors have the ends can be heat shrunk automatically, so you don't need to buy heat shrink. It's an added layer of compression. Also, it helps keep the water out, so that way if you use it in a wet environment. Now, for the remaining three, we got blue, green, and yellow. So I will hook the blue to the blue, the green to the green, and the yellow, I'll just pick one of these two colors. If you buy colored wire, because you can get wire with pinks and purples and chartreuse, so on and so forth, you can do that too. I usually just buy the standard color codes, mainly because most of the wiring I have lying around is from working on cars. So I try to keep the same color codes as I do with cars, because cars have, well, kinda, they were relatively standardized, meaning that they all, the color wires all meant the same thing. So I would put heat shrink on these and then solder them. So I'll pick the one that's got the black and the red, which is the ground, on a standard 2-wire, with a negative on a standard 2-wire. Now, just for the sake of time, I'm not going to heat shrink them. I'm just going to stick them on, just so you can see. In your display, you will have to heat shrink them. These wires cannot touch each other. Very important. It will blow the sound chip. Also, if you're doing this on your actual house and you're not just doing it with a cord like I am, make sure your house is unplugged, please. Even if the switch is off, there is still power going to the board. That is why houses that you turn the switch off, the switch is off, but yet it still runs until it powers down, until it hits its reset point. So even if the switch is off, There's still power on the circuit board. Power's not going to hurt you. You're not going to get electrocuted or anything like that. You're going to fry the circuit board. So, there you go. Also, in some cases, there are soldering irons that aren't done by heat. They're I think they call them the cold soldering irons, where they're cold until they hit something inductive and then they heat up real fast. Those actually surge power through the wires. I found out the hard way when I lit up an entire car just with a soldering iron. And it fried a lot of custom lighting we were doing. So you need to be very aware of your stuff. So make sure your house is unplugged, please. Now I'm going to use, for these remaining three, again, just so you can see the different options on one cable, I'm going to use the 3-position Wago pass-through. So this is a pass-through Wago, and that's a pass-through Wago. This is a standard Wago. You can tell they're all on the same side. This is where you put like 1 power wire in and you have 4 power wires out, or 1 ground wire, negative in and 4 negatives out, or that way it's acting as a block. A lot of like ceiling fans now come with these. They replace wire nuts. I've been using them before we started changing them because I saw they were used over in Europe, and I was impressed. And I use these not only on my house because they are rated for like 240 volts or something. 250 volts to 600 volts at 32 amps. And this one is 600 volts at max peak, or 20 amps at 300 volts. So these are high powered connections. I love them. I think they're some of the greatest things ever. I saw them on another channel I watch. He uses them all the time, or he talked about them. He talks about knockoffs too. And I've been buying them forever. That's how I do a lot of my lighting in my house and my ceiling fans. I quit using wire nuts. I don't know how many times I've opened a ceiling fan and the wire nut has worked its way off from thermal expansion contraction. Everybody's like, oh, it just wasn't on tight. No, when it gets hot in the attic here and it's 400 degrees, you know, it's Arizona in the attic. I know it's not that hot, it's hyperbole. And then it gets cold in the winter where it gets down into the teens, the things get loose. So these use a very strong spring loaded attachment, and my God, if you're not careful, when these click down, they will pinch your fingers and give you a blood blister. Ask me how I know. I still do it. I just caught my finger a second ago. But I like Wagos. The only downside to the Wagos is their size. So if you're doing it for something like this, it's really, really hard. Also, they're not a big fan of these super thin wires. These thin wires right here are actually smaller than what's recommended. But it does work. You just have to make sure they're down in the center and they're seated all the way. So it's the same thing. Once you clip them, do a little tug, make sure they're not coming out, and there you go. So here's a, what do we do? 9-inch extension. So do a close-up. Wago, pass through. I only have 1s, 2s, and 3s, but you can get them in 4s, 5s, 6, 8s, where they can do all 5 wires at once. You can do it this way too, with the doubles, because they do sell them like this, where you can put 1 in, 1 out. Again, you can see the bulk compared to that. So we have, broke my wire. We have butt connected, improper butt connected with heat shrink, soldered with heat shrink, and just the solder to show you how the solder goes. And then how I do it again is I just fold the wire like so, and then slide the heat shrink over. This is the tightest, cleanest way, especially since once you're done, you can literally, since it fell, you can literally take a piece of heat shrink and already have it slid on your wire. You always want to make sure you have your heat shrink on before you do the soldering. And then once you have it soldered like that, you can just do this and heat shrink the whole thing. Now, if this was in my display, of course, I would be using a piece of black. Again, I'm doing it so you can see it on camera. If this was the Christmas one, like I did the Paradrop, or the Snowflake Drop, the Parachute Snowflake one, I forgot the name of it, sorry. There's tens of thousands of animated pieces and I can't remember them all. The one I did, this white right here, this is as long as it comes. These are the strips that they're sent in. And you're talking 12 inches. So these are a foot long. I extended it 4 feet. So I used 4 of these. And when I stuck them on, how I did it was I got one on and then I heat shrunk the end just a little. And I'll show you. Actually, I'll just show you how to do it. So I'm going to heat shrink. Let me turn a little here so I can block the fan. Actually, am I running low? No, all the fluid's on the wrong side of the lighter. Hey, there we go. So you see how it's tapered. Then I would take my next one, after I heat shrunk the first one, I would slide it down, which is going to be a problem right here at the knot, like always. Let's just do this. Since again, this is just for educational purposes, I don't need to have the full length on here. I would then, see how I can slide it over the part I shrunk? And then I would really need to turn off the ceiling fan when I'm doing this. Ta-da! So now this is shrunk over that, and the two have now melted together, which makes it a stronger bond. And I did that the whole way. So it looks like one continuous piece. Now, if you don't have a lighter, because you're not a smoker or you just don't have lighters around, get the fluid back on the side with the wick. You can use a hairdryer, or if you have a heat stick, a heat pen, a heat gun, any one of the heating varieties, you can just heat the whole thing up. Once it gets up to temperature, there we go. And you can barely see the seam. You can see there's a little seam. You can see this is where my other piece of heat shrink is, a slight bulge. You can see where the wire is. It wasn't heat shrunk because it's really tight. And there's a small seam, and you can see the small bulge from where this one slid over it. So if this was your extended cord, you'd only see this at this end and this end. And if it was white, you can do it in white. The black you can also get in 12-inch sections. You can also get it in rolls, like rolls of 50, 60 feet, 25 feet. When I bought the white, they didn't have the rolls, only came in 12-inch sticks, so I got the 12-inch sticks. The black, I also buy in 12-inch sticks. Sometimes they're 10, sometimes they're 8. A lot of times they show up like this, where they're just 3-4 inches long in cases like this. Sometimes they just show up in little baggies. They're not even in hard cases. Heat shrinks, heat shrink. As far as like the clear stuff goes, because they do make heat shrink and clear, I have it in sizes I have 50-foot rolls of it, and I did that for custom wiring in a car. I have it in really thin and really fat, so you can run like 10 wires through it. So that way you can see the rainbow effect of the wiring. It was to make it look pretty for a show car. They wanted the wiring to be shown, so we removed all this sheathing and ran clear, which to me, I don't know, I like the black better than having a rainbow color on a black car. It just looked funny for the wiring. Because it was like orange, yellow, green, black, red, purple. It was like 12 wires. It was for the ECM, which you normally don't see in your car. But everybody has their own designs, and I just built whatever they wanted. So here you go. Here is the different options on how to extend it. I was hoping the video wouldn't be this long, but you can use butt connectors. You can use solder and heat shrink. You can heat shrink each wire individually, or I usually just do 1 if there's 2, or 4 if there's 5, and let the outer sheath coat the last one. That's how I do it. You don't have to. So I would do like these 2 here, and then this one I leave bare, and then this one would coat them all, because I do run, when I do my extensions, I do run heat shrink the entire length. That way, when I say the entire length, I don't mean from here. I mean from like here to here. So that way there's an overlap. It keeps moisture out, and it allows a little stress relief or tension. So if you accidentally pull on the wire, you're not just pulling on the wire, you're pulling on the heat shrink that's trying to pull on this piece of sheathing. So hopefully this helps. Kind of a down and gritty way to do extensions, giving you a few options depending on your skill level and your material that you have lying around. If you have a soldering iron, I'd recommend soldering and heat shrink. It is the strongest and most efficient and effective way to do it. You can do butt connecting, but butt connecting gets really bulky really fast, and you can heat shrink it or not heat shrink it. You can buy the stuff that that is built in, and you just heat this up and it melts these ends flat so they're not flared out still. You can do Wagos. I like Wagos. Again, they're bulky. So you could even do like I did here, where you have a hybrid. So you could do the Wago on the switch end and have this whole thing soldered and nice, and that way you can unhook the switch end and move the switch somewhere else if it doesn't fit in your foam packaging, because a lot of the foam packaging doesn't have room. The new stuff is that corrugated or press board, egg crate style stuff. It works pretty good, and there's more room, so you could actually bring this out and coil it up no matter how you made it, whether you did it with Wagos, butt connectors, or solder. Now, when you roll this stuff, it doesn't curve nicely. See a little kink there? You got to be careful. You don't want to force it, because you'll break that solder joint. So you want to make sure you do a nice sweeping loop, so right on the edge, or a nice sweeping loop so it's not even as tight. That way you don't put any stress on your joints, whether it's butt or solder. Solder, you can break it inside, then you have to cut all this off and redo it. Butt connector, you risk breaking the wire right here on the edge, or right where it crimps in the steel, and then you have to cut it off and redo it, as you saw I did with that one. And I have to do with this one since it broke the end of the wire off. So, personally, I like doing the solder. It's more tedious, it's longer, a little bit more of a hassle, but you get a much better joint. Like I said, this was just to show you how to solder and to show you how to do a single strand heat shrink with a single strand exposed, and then how to overlap, so that way you can take your white or black sheath and cover the rainbow of wires you get to make it white or black sheath. Now, this white stuff does have text on it. Most of it does. There's usually text on a lot of these that tell you the temperature ratings of what they shrink at. So you can see the text right there. The black usually has a white text. This piece of black doesn't, but the yellow does. Not all of it does, but just so you know that if you want it to be pure, this green doesn't. Different manufacturers, they usually will have text on it to tell you the temperature, the rating, whether it's sun resistive or not, all the different codes. Just be aware that you get a heat shrink, it may not be pure white, it may have something written on it. The clear is clear, there's no text on it. The packaging that it came in had the text. The big rolls I bought also are the same way. It's clear. There's no text on it, but the roll has the information on it. So, any questions, you can put them below. I'll do my best to answer anything that you have. Hopefully this gives you a basic idea or assist a little bit on how to extend your wires for your on-off or on-off volume for your displays. If you don't want volume, just hook up those two and then just make sure that these three aren't touching anything. So cut them flush so that way there's no exposed wire. And then this is now an off-on switch, just like this. But anyhow, there's that one for you. Hopefully that assists in some fashion. Any questions, comments, concerns, like I said, just leave them below. I can elaborate if I miss something, but my preferred method is solder and heat shrink. My second preferred method would be the Wagos because you can disconnect them. And my least preferred method would be the butt connectors because of the size. And that's just because these animated houses have very small wires. And we're trying to limit how much bulk we put because it makes it harder to cover it up when you're building your displays. So, all right, till the next one, have a good one.